In this video, we'll talk about scales, and in particular, the major scale, the whole tone semitone pattern that underlies the formation of scales, and in this particular case, our major scale, and what transposition is and how to do it. So first, a word of advice. We have gotten to a point here in this YouTube series where we can identify notes and rhythms. This is a preliminary and very important step in understanding music theory. But my advice to you now is to go and find scores of your favorite songs, whatever the genre, pop, rock, jazz, classical, and get as much practice reading music as you can. The purpose of this series of videos is to expose and to shed light on concepts, but these things can actually be pretty abstract and dry unless you put it into practice. So listening to music and following along with the score can bring all of these things to life. Music theory really is sort of unrewarding, in fact, until you do this, until you see it applied in music, and preferably to the music that you like listening to. One of the cool things about YouTube and the internet in general, but YouTube in specific, is that there's so much great music available here, just, a click away. A lot of the videos, even, this is mostly dealing, to my knowledge, with classical and jazz. These videos provide the score so you can listen and read the music at the same time. Another possibility for you is that a lot of classical music is in public domain, especially the type of classical music from 200, 300, 150 years ago. And it's the kind of music you would think of as classical music if you would tune, a radio station, a classical music radio station like WNED here in Buffalo, or if you would watch, Tom and Jerry or Looney Tunes. Those are the pieces that are cherished in the canon, and most of them are in public domain, so you can find them to download for free online at sites like imslp.org, or even simply by Googling. Another option for you in YouTube score following videos, there's a user that I'd like to draw your attention to, Gerubach or Gerubach. I'm not quite sure how this would be pronounced, but they provide scores by Bach, by this Baroque composer, following in real time with the cursor on top of the notes that are being played. So, if you don't know Bach, or if you already know Bach, it's worth checking out their channel. It's actually, I don't know if they are paid to do this, if that's the part of their job or their hobby, but you can see that it's a work of love, because there's a lot of work that go into their videos. They're really detailed and made with a lot of care. Okay. So now that we are past that, we know a lot about notes, staffs, clefs, rhythms, meter, etc. Right? So we can identify notes, identify rhythms, but how does a composer go about choosing which notes to use and which not to use when writing a piece or a song? Which notes are right, which notes are wrong? One answer that often turns out to be true is scales. Composers use scales when writing their music. Musical scales are collections or sets of notes that people writing music rely on, to give music a sort of consistency or coherence. Scales inform composers which notes are appropriate, which notes are not as appropriate, and how these notes should relate one to another, how they should behave. There are so many different scales in the world. If you just Google scales, you're going to come up with, dozens, maybe hundreds of different scales, which vary, according to time and culture and country, etc. But over time in Western classical music, and to a certain degree in pop and rock and all of those other genres, things have coalesced around two main scales, which are called the major scale and the minor scale. So we'll talk first about the major scale, We'll dedicate 2 or 3 videos to the major scale, and then we'll go to the minor scale and talk about that. The major scale divides the octave into 7 different notes. Say you play these 7 notes going up. Typically when we deal with scales, we're talking about ascending steps, a series of 7 ascending steps. The 8th note then will be the same one that you played in the first place, right? The very first note, but an octave higher. The 9th note will be the second note that you played, but an octave higher, etc. Right? So here you have a little bit of an idea of a scale. Major scales are called after the note they begin with, plus the adjective major or the qualifier major. So this scale starts on middle C. It's the C scale. And since I'm telling you, right, that this is a major scale, this is the C major scale. You can obtain C major by playing only the white keys of the keyboard, one after another, in sequence, starting on C. And then you end on C an octave higher. So remember, I just told you that you play 7 notes, and the 8th note will be the same note as the first one. Here it is as well. So I put it here starting on middle C, that very important note that has often been an emphasis in our conversations. But I also provided the same scale, the C major scale, but an octave below, right? 1 octave below middle C with a bass clef. So you can see that it doesn't matter which clef you use, which octave you play the scale in. If it starts on C and ends here, the 8th note is C again, right? So there's 7 notes between C and C. That is the C major scale, whatever the octave you play that. You can see that you already know how to identify these notes, that these are the white notes of the keyboard, right? So you know what to call them. This is C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then back to C. It sounds like this. Right? And then I ended on the very first note that I played in the C major scale here. You can imagine that if I keep playing it, past the octave, if there was more to this staff here, the notes would repeat, like I promised. The next note here would be a D. The note after that would be an E, F, G, A, B. So the 7 notes are kind of self-replicating here at the octave. And then once again. And I could do this ad infinitum. Always the same 7 letter names, the same 7 notes, whatever the octave I play it in. Each of these 7 notes of the major scale are called scale degrees. There are 3 ways of referring to scale degrees. The easiest and most common is by using numbers. So scale degree 1 is C, scale degree 2 in C major is D, scale degree 3 in C major is E, etc. You can see that I put all of the numbers here. Once we get to scale degree 7, in this case of C major, B, we come back to scale degree 1 again, which is C. So there's no scale degree 8 or 9. There are only 7. Another way to refer to scale degrees is by what is called solfege syllables here in America, and I believe elsewhere as well. Solfege is a technique taught in music schools and choirs where people learn how to sight read music, right? They're given music and they have to read it right off the bat and sing at the same time. It sounds easy, like maybe reading a book, right? Just reading a sentence, putting the letters together to form words and sentences. But actually, solfege can be rather tricky. To make things easier, people then sing syllables rather than numbers when they do solfege. Part pragmatic, part a tradition that has evolved over time. The syllables are borrowed from the note names in Romance languages. You may know these already. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and then we're back to do. This way of referring to scale degrees is also called movable do, because unlike in Romance languages, there do is always C, re is always D, mi is always E, etc. So that's called a fixed do. But But as we're going to see here, as we go to different major scales, scale degree 1 is always called do. So basically, do can be any note with any letter name, with or without an accidental. So this is also called the movable do system. And finally, each scale degree has a proper name. These names will become a lot more important when we deal with triads and chords, which are not notes in isolation or scale degrees in isolation, but groups of scale degrees put together. But these names can also be used to refer to individual scale degrees, like you see here. Tonic is the scale degree 1, supertonic, the one that goes above tonic, scale degree 2, mediant 3, right? Subdominant, dominant, submediant, and leading tone. We'll come back to these names when we deal with chords and triads at a later occasion. Here I put the notes of C major in order, the 7 notes that belong to C major, and the 3 different ways we can refer to these scale degrees. What makes this scale then a major scale, and how is it different from a minor scale, which I mentioned at the beginning, or any other scales for that matter? The answer is in the internal structure of the scale, and its DNA, if you will. We will analyze the quality of a scale, that is, what name we give it, major, minor, etc., through the distances that we find between adjacent notes of the scale. In major scales, there are 2 distances or intervals between adjacent notes. Interval is the musical term, the more appropriate musical term for a distance between 2 notes. In major scales, there are 2 possible intervals, a semitone or a whole tone. You'll remember that a semitone is the shortest distance between 2 adjacent keys on the keyboard. If you're looking here at this layout of the piano keyboard, you can see that we have semitones. This is, by the way, whole tone, semitone, etc., is the distance between 2 white keys, right? Any 2 adjacent white keys. And you can see we have a semitone between E and F and B and C, like we talked previously, because there's no black key between them. But if we want a semitone up from C, we're going to go to the black key above it, because that's the shortest interval or shortest distance between 2 different adjacent keys, right? If we're on this black key and we want to go a semitone up, then we go to D over here, right? Likewise, if we go from C to D, we're going 1 and 2 semitones. Now the definition, or another name for 2 semitones, is a whole tone, like we also have talked previously. So these are the 2 distances we're talking about when dealing with a major scale, whole tones and semitones. If we calculate then the intervals between each 2 adjacent scale degrees, what we're going to get is this. Between C and D, we have a whole tone. We're skipping over a black key, right? So we go a semitone here and then a semitone here. 2 semitones make a whole tone. Between D and E, it's the same case. We have another whole tone. E to F, scale degree 3 to 4, we have a semitone. There's no black key in between. You keep calculating, you end up with this DNA, or this intervallic structure. Whole tone, semitone, whole tone, semitone. This pattern is the DNA of a major scale, C major scale, and as we'll promptly see, any major scales bear this intervallic pattern. So, now that we know what the DNA is, we can make clones of it, so to speak. We can start major scales at any note, right? We know the recipe. This act of moving a pattern of intervals, right, or music distances, namely, in this case, whole tones and semitones, when we move that pattern to start at a different note, this act is called transposition. So, if we transpose C major to G, this is what we get. Scale degree 1 is G. We know that the DNA for a major scale is whole tone, semitone, whole tone, whole tone, whole tone, semitone. So now we go a whole tone above that. Scale degree 2 is A. We need another whole tone above that, B. And we need a semitone, C. If this is hard for you to picture or to understand or to visualize, think about a piano layout, right? And remember that between B and C, there is no black key. So this already is a whole semitone. From C to D, we have another whole tone. D to E, we have a whole tone. Now, here, between E and F, the scale degree 6 and 7 in G major, E and F make only a semitone. So if we are to abide by the recipe, by the DNA of a major scale, we need to transform this E to F from a semitone to a whole tone, right? So the way to do this is to increase the distance. E to F is only one semitone away. We need to make it two semitones. So if we go to the black key that is immediately above F, right? If I go back here, you can see E to F is a semitone away. If I go then to this black key, I will have E, and then one semitone, two semitones. I'll have a whole tone from E. So a whole tone up from E is this black key here, which is F sharp. And then F sharp to G, if you'll come back, F sharp to G is a semitone. So we close here the scale, back to scale degree 1. Right? So you can see that the accidental was necessary so that we could abide by the intervallic pattern, by the recipe of whole tones and semitones of a major scale. So if we look here at the same graph that I showed you before, where I have the notes in C major and now the notes in G major, you'll see that the scale degree numbers are applied to them in this way, right? G is scale degree 1, or Do, or also called tonic. Scale degree 2 is A, Re, supertonic, etc. So what we're doing here is we're transposing all of this to start at a different note. And remember, because we needed that same pattern of whole tones and semitones, now scale degree 7 is F sharp, so we needed an accidental to obey that, that pattern, which is scale degree 7, T, also called the leading tone. Notice that I called the black key above F, F sharp, but we know that each black key can be called in one of two ways because of enharmonic equivalence, right? The other possible name for that black key is G flat. Let's go back to the keyboard. Maybe we can visualize that. So we have F here on this side, and we have G here, and we have this black key, which is our key of interest. If we start on F and go a semitone above, that is F sharp. If we think about it from the G, from the viewpoint of G, we're going down a semitone, and that is a G flat, right? So why did I choose F sharp in the G major scale and not G flat, like it would have looked like here? The reason is because major scales as well as minor scales and a host of other scales have the following two rules. Number one, each letter name must be associated with only one scale degree, right? So we can't have the letter name G associated with both scale degrees 7 and 1, right? Because these are two Gs. Even though this is a G flat and this is just a G, we still have two Gs in the mix here. So that's breaking rule number 1. Rule number 2, adjacent scale degrees must always use adjacent letter names, or in other words, they must be steps. So if we had called scale degree 7 a G flat instead of an F sharp, we would have scale degree 6 E, skip F, and go to a non-adjacent letter name, G, right? So here, from 6 to 7, we're skipping a letter. We're going from E to G, and that's also breaking rule number 2. So we need scale degree 7 to be an F, but because we need that black key, then we call it an F sharp. These two rules hold true for all major and minor scales, and they help us choose the appropriate name for the black keys and sometimes even for white keys. That is, whenever we need accidentals and we need to choose between the enharmonic possibilities, is it a flat or is it a sharp? Those are the rules that help us choose between those two options. One last point. Notice that the incorrect version of the G major scale features a symbol, an accidental we have not seen previously. It looks like a slanted triangle, not quite like a diamond, but a slanted rectangle with two protruding lines here. This is called the natural sign. In music, basically, when you write an accidental next to a note, that note will be changed for the duration of the measure. If within the same measure you need two versions of the same note, like in this case here, this is not a measure because we don't have meter here, we don't have a time signature, but let's pretend that this is the whole thing here is a measure. If this is happening in a single measure and I need both G flat and G natural, right, G with no accidental, then I clarify that the second G does not have an accidental with, or in other words, right, is natural, quote unquote, by writing the natural sign. The natural sign is also used in music to clarify ambiguities whenever they happen. Okay, if we keep transposing the major scale to different starting points, we'll discover that all major scales use accidentals in order to abide by that whole tone semitone pattern, except for C major, which does not have any accidentals. Transposing the major scale reveals a number of emerging patterns that come with that action and that become apparent in something called the circle of fifths. So that is the topic for our next video. Thanks a lot for watching.